Willie F. Tolliver. Dr. Tolliver has been on the faculty of the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College since 1992. He's also on the Social Welfare Doctoral Faculty at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He teaches graduate level courses in social welfare policy, organizational theory, and he's the co-chair for Social Work Practice and Learning Lab in the MSW program. In September 2016, Dr. Tolliver was appointed Director of Social Justice and Equity Education at the Silberman School of Social Work. In 2019, Professor Tolliver completed a 3-year foundation-funded project with a New York City agency employing 17,000 people. Quite a big agency, I would imagine. So thank you, Dr. Tolliver, for presenting to us, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Ruth. It is great to see you, and good afternoon, everyone. Full disclosure, I came to this topic late in my career. I believe in 2015, when Michael Brown was killed in August out in Ferguson, Missouri, and then Eric Garner on Staten Island. And by November of that fall, the grand juries came back with a finding that there were no charges to be brought against the police officers who killed Michael Brown out in Ferguson and Eric Garner in Staten Island, New York. And I was blown away by our students' reactions to these grand jury findings. Some of you may recall that people poured out into the streets, but particularly in our school, students were in tears, and they came to me at the time, and actually they staged a walkout of the school, and they went out, I think it was a Wednesday and a Thursday. They had a 2-day walkout, and they ended up on the streets, 3rd Avenue, sitting down in the middle of the intersection of 3rd Avenue and 119th Street. And when they came back into the building, I invited them to come into a room, and I sat down on the floor and listened to them. And in tears, they talked about how here they were in a school of social work where they were being taught how to be supportive of people in pain, and very few faculty in the school actually gave them time when they came together in classrooms to talk about their reactions to what was happening in the country as a result of these grand jury decisions. And at the end of this meeting, I met with them 2 days, that Wednesday and Thursday. They said to us that it wasn't enough for faculty to teach them about racism. They needed to understand the history of how racism got created in the United States of America. So this started us on a journey. And I chair, as Ruth shared with you, the practice lab. And the practice lab at our school is a 2-semester course. So we introduce into the lab books, history books, that our students would read over the course of the 2 semesters to help them understand this history of how race got created in the United States of America. One of the books is Howard Zinn's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States of America. A second book that we use is Ruth Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States of America. We also use Juan Gonzalez's book, Harvest of Empire, which presents a history of Spanish-speaking people in what is now the United States of America. And we offer a book, The Making of Asian Americans. And that book is a recent contribution because prior to the 1960s, people who we identify today as Asian Americans were called Orientals in the United States. So those are the first 4 books that we offer in the first semester. Second semester, there are books about the history of disability in the United States of America and other topics. But that's how I got into this content. So this first slide is a depiction of of some stills of what happened in New York City on May 2nd of 2020. I remember this day vividly. The Friday before this Saturday, May 1st, in the evening news, reporters anchor people were acknowledging that the weather was going to be fabulous on Saturday. It would be like 70-degree weather. And New Yorkers would pour out onto the streets because we had been on shutdown due to the pandemic. And of course, you see on the left side of the screen, you see people in a park there in Manhattan, some of them sunbathing, and police officers walking around passing out masks. In the news report, the news coverage rather, on that Friday, the mayor had announced that there would be police out in force, making certain that people were keeping physical distance and also wearing masks. On the other side of the screen, you see a plainclothes policeman. And if you look down on the pavement, you see a Black man and the policeman's knee is on his neck. And this is before George Floyd. This is May 2nd. George Floyd was murdered later in May of 2020. So you see this difference in the way human beings are being treated by police. I don't want to spend too much time with this because it's actually a video in the middle, but I think I'm going to just keep moving through because of our time. But I'll play just a little bit of it, and you'll see that these are plainclothes police, and they are arresting someone here. I'm going to move this along. Okay, and you see the police officer's knee. And this is just a kid who walked up and was asking what was going on, right? I want to pause here to say that this police officer who is wearing the black t-shirt and the denim pants actually resigned in October of 2020. He was charged as a result of these young people videotaping this stop on the pavement down in Alphabet City of New York City, Manhattan. This slide shows the slave routes in the medieval age on the continent of Africa. And this material was added to some work that I did, and we will talk about that at the end of this PowerPoint, looking at the movement of Africans to other parts of the world. This next map actually addresses how those of us of African descent got to the Americas, North America, South America, and Central America. And you see the areas of the continent of Africa, mostly West Africa, except for some from Southeast Africa, moving across to the Americas. I've spent quite a bit of time myself in Senegambia, Senegal and the Gambia region of West Africa, and also a great deal of time on the Gold Coast, which is Ghana in West Africa. Both of these places, Senegal and Ghana, have what are called slave castles. In Senegal, they're called the House of Slaves. In Senegal, in Dakar, they're located on Gorée Island. And it's a powerful experience to actually go to Gorée Island and visit the House of Slaves. On the particular day that I visited with some people of African descent from the United States, from New York City, Mr. Njai, who's the curator for the museum, said in French to some Europeans who were visiting the House of Slaves, "You see those African Americans over there? They are our strongest people, because they were not supposed to survive what happened to them. They were not supposed to survive what happened to them. Quite frankly, many, many Africans went from the west coast of Africa to Brazil, the area of South America that we call Brazil. I've also visited Bahia, which has the second highest number of Black people in the world, second only to Nigeria. The Portuguese brought so many Africans to that area of Brazil, and we were told that if you put ships in the water on the west coast of Africa and just let them drift, they would drift to Brazil. Fascinating. Okay. The first recorded history of Africans arriving in what we now call the United States of America was in 1619. And you know that there was a great deal of tumult around the 1619 Project from the New York Times, published in 2019. About 20 plus Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. I believe the month was August. And they were sold into indentured servitude. In a short period of time after their arrival, by 1641, Massachusetts was the first state colony to officially legalize slavery, while Mississippi became the last state to officially abolish it in 1995. By 1662, the Virginia colony decreed that children shall be the bond or free according to the condition of the mother. This is very different from English law, which these people were from England who were now writing these laws for Virginia, because in England, children were bond or free depending upon the condition of the mother. But here, the law was changed on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. Children would be bond or free based upon the condition of the mother. So mothers were literally given in the position of producing children who could then be bond for labor. There were many rebellions. Whenever you have oppression, wherever people are being treated and held under tyranny, people rebel. But this rebellion in 1676 is important. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon was himself one of the members of the ruling elite, but Bacon wanted more land. He wanted more indigenous land. And he was concerned that the ruling elites of the Virginian colony were not moving fast enough to incorporate land. So he put together a group of Negroes and indentured servants to fight this rebellion with him so that they could take over indigenous land and increase his land holdings. And this is what happened as a result of it. After Bacon's rebellion, the wealthy elites responded to the growing solidarity between poor whites and enslaved Africans by treating whites and Blacks differently in order to inhibit class consciousness and promote racial separation. For decades, the only difference between white and Black servants was that the latter were occasionally servants for life. But in the face of growing class-based resistance, the elites used racist justifications to create legal racial distinctions. And they went further than that. They actually made it against the law for Blacks to have weapons. They could not have guns. Whites could have weapons. White men could have weapons, and white men could have access to any woman. Black men could only have access to Black women. Between 1680 and 1705, slave laws reflected this new racism. Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 declared that all servants imported and brought to this country who were not Christians in their native country shall be slaves. Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves shall be held as real estate. And that's a major distinction. Unlike other slave societies in the world, in this country, slaves were property. They were property like your cattle, house, quite frankly, excuse me, quite frankly, when people needed to borrow money, the collateral that they put up were their slaves. I visited plantations and looked at the ledgers of the plantation owners, and they would have listed as their um, collateral all of the people, the Negroes who were on their plantation, and a dollar value next to each one. So that when they went to borrow money to buy crops or to buy fertilizer or whatever they needed to purchase, these Negro, their slaves, were their collateral. 1861, 1865, the Civil War is fought in the United States of America. Abe Lincoln is given a great deal of credit for the Emancipation Proclamation. Very few people know this about President Lincoln. Lincoln was a reluctant emancipator. In 1862, Lincoln summoned to the White House African-American male leaders to sit down with him. And when they sat down, he literally said to them, okay, here's the deal. This is not up for debate. I want to send Africans back to places in Central America and to West Africa, Liberia. Africans are a problem in this country, and white people are a problem for Africans in this country, African descended people. So therefore, the best thing for these slaves is to have them leave the United States of America and go to Central America and or Liberia. And truthfully, some left. Some people left. I grew up in a part of the United States in North Florida called Apalachicola, and there in Apalachicola, Florida, on the Apalachicola River in 1812, the British established a fort, and it was called the fort at Prospect Bluff. The British recruited runaway slaves who were living on the Apalachicola River, because at the time in 1812, Appalachia, Florida was a Spanish territory. So Africans and indigenous people hid out in Florida to get away from slaveholders. And they were living here in this Spanish territory. So the British recruited them to fight the War of 1812 to try to take the colonies back. Of course, the British were unsuccessful. And by 1816, the British left the state of Florida, the territory of Florida, and turned the fort over to the Negroes and the Red Stick Creek Indians who were living there. And Andrew Jackson, who was in charge of protecting the southern part of the United States of America, sent Union troops into Spanish territory of Florida to blow up the fort, or to his actual directions to the military was that you should go in, bring these people to heel, and return them to their rightful owners. Return them to their rightful owners. So here they are going into a Spanish territory to bring Africans back into slavery. And this is the government doing this. This is not some kind of ragtag group of Southerners going looking for their slaves. This is the government returning people to slaves. And those Union troops were successful in blowing up the fort. And the people who survived actually went into deeper parts of the territory of Florida and worked with the Seminole Native people to fight the Seminole War. But the reason I wanted to tell you that story is because when the British left in 1812, the British gave the Negroes and the Red Stick Creek Indians the opportunity to leave the Spanish territory and go with them to live in other British holdings in the Caribbean, and some of the Africans left, just as some left in 1862. I have a colleague who is an anthropologist who have gone to South America to study people of African descent who left the United States or the territory of Florida to escape the tyranny of slavery because they felt that it was coming. Finally, in 1863, Lincoln does sign the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing 3 million slaves in the Confederate States. And shortly thereafter, Lincoln is killed and Andrew Johnson becomes the president. I wanted to include this slide to show you the kind of nativism reactions that were occurring in the United States even back then. The 1864 Immigration Encouragement Act was to help fill jobs left by Army soldiers with contract labor. Yet the influx of foreign labor drove down wages, and contract labor became a rallying cry for anti-immigrant sentiment and violence. No sooner than even before slavery was ended, the Southern ruling elite, found another way that was given to them by the 13th Amendment to re-enslave Black people. After the Civil War bankrupted most states, the states passed discriminatory laws to arrest and imprison large numbers of Black people, then leased the prisoners to private individuals and corporations as cheap labor. The money states earned from this new form of slavery paid for public education, infrastructure, and grants to former plantation owners to rebuild their industry. Convict leasing continued in this country from 1864 to 1928. If you would like to read a book about this, if you have time to read during this shutdown, the book I would recommend is Slavery by Another Name, written by a Wall Street journalist who set out actually to learn which corporations actually benefited from slavery. But when he happened upon this story, he found this story far more interesting and wrote the book about convict leasing. This is a very famous photograph. It's a bit blurred here. It's rather old, but thousands of Black people were forced into a brutal system that historians have actually referred to as being worse than slavery. If you get a chance to read Slavery by Another Name, the stories are really horrific. Here's a map, a 1900 map, depicting in red the states that actually participated in convict leasing. These are states, and this is an interesting part of American history too, because you think about these folks and what made people a convict. So you have to commit a crime, but what were the crimes? The crimes were actually created, and the crimes were things like vagrancy. And vagrancy meant that you picked me up on the streets of a town and I only had 75 cents in my pocket. And that's insufficient for me to take care of myself. Therefore, I am a vagrant. So I get arrested and I'm put in jail, and then I'm charged for being in jail. And there, of course, are not enough judges to litigate all of these cases or to hold hearings for all of these cases. So people who are like general store owners, people who own a general store, I guess a general store might be like a mini supermarket. They have no expertise in law, but they are made magistrates, and they get to decide the truth, the guilt or innocence of someone. Once the person is found guilty, by this time, the cost that the person is in debt for is about $75, and $75 is a great deal of money. So someone who has a business like a corporation, the city of Birmingham in Alabama came into existence after the Civil War. Birmingham, like its English country, city, is a city that is dealing with metal ores. So people are making steel, they are mining for iron, and they're also mining for coal. The African people of African descent are permitted to work in the coal. Only white people can work in steel and iron. They all live in company residences in Birmingham, but the white people live at the front part of the company housing, and the African people of African descent live deep in the bowels of the company housing, because that's where all of the pollution is, the smoke from the coal and so forth. So you begin to see how these distinctions show up that are made in slavery continue in freedom through something like convict leasing in the United States of America. The Reconstruction era begins. There's some interesting books about this too. One of them written by a historian who was teaching in the South, and I think he was in Mississippi, I can't remember exactly, white man asked his students in his class, Black students, students of African descent, do you know anything about Reconstruction? And the kids said, yes, that's when Black people were put in charge and they messed up so poorly that white people had to take over again. That's not quite true, but it's interesting that that's what these young people thought. So this author wrote a book. The title is escaping me right now. Maybe it'll come to me as we go along. But it's about, I think the title is The Lies My Teacher Taught Me, which is about this history and how the history was filled with lies and untruths about Reconstruction. No sooner than the Reconstruction starts, we have Black codes. And what are Black codes? Southern states enacted Black codes that allowed African Americans certain rights, but denied them rights to testify against whites, to serve on juries or in state militias, to vote or start a job without the approval of their previous employer. The codes also ensured Black people's availability for cheap labor even after slavery was abolished. These are some of the first Black members of Congress. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 made this possible. The Black codes were repealed and Black men were empowered with the vote. This is also fascinating because the two people depicted here in this photograph are Irish. They are Irish descent. This is a photograph of Mr. and Mrs. Patrick O'Malley on their wedding day in 1884. The state of Virginia viewed these two people as colored. In fact, if you look at the caricatures of depictions of Irish people during this period of time, they look very much like the caricatures of African people. The Irish and the Africans were depicted as apes. On the marriage certificate, you see both are listed as colored. As we can see, race is not simply a matter of physical appearance or skin color. Race is mainly a function of the meaning we give these things. Race is also a construct of our legal system. Now, this is fascinating. If, in fact, race is neutral and does not offer any kind of advantages, what would prompt people to actually file suits in courts to be declared white? Federal laws racially restricted citizenship under naturalization to white people, and a number of people sued the government for the privilege of being declared white. The courts had to establish by law whether a petitioner's race was to be measured by skin color, facial features, national origin, language, culture, ancestry, the speculations of scientists, popular opinion, or some combination of these factors. In short, the courts were responsible for deciding not only who was white, but why someone was white. If you're interested in this content, I recommend the book Working Toward Whiteness. Working Toward Whiteness, because the author of that book makes the case that having the courts declare you as white gave you access to things, property, and whiteness, quite frankly, it becomes a property at this point too, that the courts are determining who can have access to it. These next slides I'm going to move through rather quickly, but I wanted to just give you some indication of how the courts made their decisions. This first slide shows mostly Chinese people, people of Chinese descent, going to court to be declared white. And then you see in these cases, all are determined not to be white. Hawaiians and Burmese as well. And on the far right, you see the reasons given by the court for why these people are not white. Here we see Japanese petitioning the courts to be declared white. And again, reasons why they are not white. Here, Mexicans. Now, quite frankly, there was a treaty between Mexico and the United States in the 1800s where the United States promised to treat Mexicans as they treated white people. But here, Mexicans are white, Native Americans are not white. Asian Indians, these are people from India, are white. Excuse me. Syrians, Henry Louis Gates' work, he actually has a video where he's talking to the queen, I think it is of Syria, I may be mistaken about this, and talking about the ancestors of this particular queen and how they petitioned to be white as well. Filipinos are not white. Armenians are white, but Koreans are not white. People from Arabia are not white. Afghanis are not white. And then 1870, we began to see anti-immigration laws. The Page Act banned Chinese women from immigrating to the United States. And in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented skilled and unskilled laborers from China from immigrating, and is the first law implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. And this is an interesting history to look at what was the reasoning behind this. And some of the reasoning had to do with Chinese males not being perceived as manly enough. They were not masculine enough. The Naturalization Act of 1870, the law extended naturalization process to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent, but Asians remained ineligible for naturalization. Here, where convict leasing is operating to control and surveil the criminal element of the African descended community, Jim Crow evolved as a way of apartheid, a method of apartheid to actually keep the races apart, white versus black. I wasn't born in 1876, but I was born during this period. The first time I visited New York from Florida, we departed at a train station in Tallahassee, Florida, and had to go to the colored waiting room. And we had to remain in the colored section of the train until we got to the Mason-Dixon line, which was Washington, D.C. And at that point, I could move to any part of the train that I wanted to. But as long as the train was in the South, I had to stay in the colored section of the train, drink water from the fountain that had a sign above it that said colors only, go in, eat in a space for colored people in the waiting room, just a way of dehumanizing and letting me know as a very young child that I was not like the other people who had the freedom to move around and go wherever they wanted to go. While I'm taking this pause, I should also tell you, when my mother gave birth to me, I was born on the colored side of the hospital. There was a colored side and a white side. I came home to live in a community for colored people. Housing was segregated. I went to a Catholic school for colored children. Our nuns were women of color from New Orleans, Louisiana. The priests were all white. Recently, I've looked at some of those photographs taken during the period of time when I was at the Catholic school. Um, all of the priests in the photographs are identified. All of the children and the Black nuns have no names. And subsequently, people are now showing us these photographs, asking us if we can remember the names of the Black children, recognize ourselves, and do we remember the names of the Black nuns? This is one way of erasing history and centering by naming only the white priests, not the nuns, and not the children. The Great Migration is also a part of my family's history. But the Great Migration involved 6 million African Americans leaving the South to resettle in the cities of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast. Those of us who lived on the East Coast, Southeast, and Florida went directly north. We went to where the trains would take us, went directly north. So I have family members who left Florida and they went to Philadelphia, they went to New Jersey, they went to New York. Some African Americans went as far as Boston. We did not leave because we wanted to. We left because of the tyranny and horror of the in the southern parts of the United States. In my own family, 2 family members were lynched for no, they were not convicted of any crime. They were lynched because it was believed that they had done something wrong. One of them, who was lynched in the 1930s, Reuben Stacy, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. People like Mary McLeod Bethune, an African-American woman who was really close to Eleanor Roosevelt, thought that they would be able to use the lynching of Reuben to convince FDR to support an anti-lynching bill in Congress. He refused to do so because he was afraid of what Southern Democrats might do to his legislative agenda. Brian Stevenson's organization in Montgomery actually has documented over 4,000 lynchings during this period of African Americans in the South. And as I understand it, I haven't gone to the museum yet there to see this, but there's an exhibit with mason jars containing the soil from underneath the trees where these people were lynched. Now, lynching, pardon me, lynching in and of itself was a horror, but the consequence of it was to strike terror into the hearts of the living. Subsequently, family members of people who were lynched would run away in the dark of night, leaving their homes and their property, and white people would take over their lands and property at no cost, simply take them. As you look up the history of Forsyth County, Georgia, in Georgia, where hundreds of Black people were killed, and for decades, no Blacks lived in Forsyth County, Georgia, until I think it was the 90s that Oprah Winfrey in her show actually did a show from Forsyth County where they took up conversations about what happened when Blacks were slaughtered and killed by whites who wanted them out of their counties. Some of you may know of what happened in Tulsa on Black Wall Street. We also had a city here, a town here in Florida, Rosewood, Florida, where whites became very upset about the success of Black people in Rosewood and went into that town in the dark of night and burned and ran people out of their homes. Here in the state of Florida in the 1990s, Congressman, who's current day Congressman Al Lawson, who was back then a member of the Florida House of Representatives, was successful with other legislators here in Florida to actually get people reimbursed, the survivors of Rosewood, Florida's massacre, to get them reimbursed for their properties. So people were not leaving of their own free will. They were being chased out of the South. And as they went to the North, they found that things were not all welcoming for them there either. This is an interesting book and is written by Muhammad is his last name, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who's currently teaching at Harvard. The title of the book is Condemnation of Blackness. Because of time, I won't tell you very much about this, except to say that this book is about how after the 1890 census, the 1890 census would be 25 years out from the Emancipation Proclamation. So sociologists and people who were interested, like us, people who are in human services, were interested to see how would Black people do 25 years after slavery. And the data came out, and the data showed that although Blacks were only 12% of the population in the United States, they were 30% of the people locked up in prison. And this data point was used to construe that African descended people were criminal and inherently inferior. It didn't occur to folks that 25 years out from slavery, maybe there were some trauma issues that were impacting the way people managed themselves in society. Maybe the fact that people were not permitted by law to be taught how to read and write. Their ancestors were not taught how to read and write, contributed to the condition of these folks who were 25 years out from slavery. But here's the real kicker. At the same time that these African Americans are being seen as criminals, Irish, Italian, and Jews are also living in ghettos in major cities. And their behavior is also criminal. These very same sociologists said the government should invest in these Irish, Italian, and Jews because they can be brought into the body of the United States of America. They can be made contributing citizens. But these people, these African descended people, are an inferior group. And here, progressives, liberals join conservatives. Blacks, Northern free Blacks, also joined this, this cry, this call to not help this population of people. In fact, the thinking was this population of people, these African descended people, were headed for extinction. This is what was going to happen to them. We would do better to just leave them alone and let them die out. In this 1924 Reed Act completely excludes immigrants from Asia. So you see this line of thinking with regard to Asians continues into the 1920s. And not only Asians, here we see Filipinos now are repatriated. Filipinos were restricted from traveling to the mainland United States, and those living in the US were sent back to the Philippines by the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1935. We know about the internment of Japanese during World War II. But why didn't FDR do the same thing to Germans living in the United States? Why only Japanese? Something for you to think about. 1942 to 1964, the Bracero Program. Labor shortages during World War II prompt the United States to temporarily allow 4.5 million Mexican agricultural workers to legally enter the United States. When the program ended in 1964, the participants were deported back to Mexico, leaving behind families, communities, and property. 1942 to 1970, Puerto Ricans began moving to the mainland. And this last part of the presentation shows structural racism, how what happened in the past doesn't stay in the past, but actually follows us here into the present. Housing, 1934, the way most of us purchase our homes today. The government-sponsored Homeowners Loan Corporation drew a red line on a map to delineate the area where banks would not invest. This results in mortgage discrimination in which middle-income Black and Latinx residents are denied loans available to lower-income whites. These neighborhood classifications were later used by the GI Bill and the Federal Housing Administration to decide who was worthy of home loans. Here is a redlining map of Brooklyn. Red areas were largely African American. The mere presence of one African American in a neighborhood was sufficient for that neighborhood to be redlined, meaning that that neighborhood would receive no mortgages from banks. In Detroit, Michigan, there's an 8-mile situation where whites were told you cannot get loans because you're too close to a Black community. The whites built a wall, a concrete bunker wall between them and the Blacks, and the banks changed their red line to give them access to loans. The mere presence of a wall separating them from Black communities. You think about public policy with regard to servicemen and the GI Bill. My family members fought in World War I and in World War II. The federally funded but state administered program offered veterans a year of unemployment pay after their homecoming, guarantees for loans to purchase homes, businesses or farms, and tuition and living stipends for college or vocational programs. But Black veterans weren't able to make use of the housing provisions of the GI Bill because banks generally wouldn't make loans for mortgages in Black neighborhoods. And even when they did, the values of the home fell. Or quite frankly, there's a video that you can find online called The House We Live In. And I would recommend you look at that. The House We Live In. When Blacks were able to move into neighborhoods where white people lived, real estate agents will go around to the white people and say, you need to leave because Blacks are moving in. And they would get the white people to sell their homes at less than the value of the home, then inflate the value of the home and sell them to Black people. And as those neighborhoods became Black, they did in fact lose value. Social Security Act of 1935 disproportionately excluded Black and brown people. It was written into the law that farm workers and people who were domestic workers would not qualify for Social Security. So the large number of Black and brown people who were working in farm labor or as domestic employees did not receive Social Security. And finally, the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 is signed into law by Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is not considered a friend of people of African descent. He grew up in Texas, but he gave a very famous speech at Howard University in Washington, D.C. during the 1960s, in which he admitted to this history. He acknowledged that African Americans had been really given a raw deal in this country, that they had labored so hard to help build, and that there was time to level the playing field. So here's a question. Now that you have this historical context, where do you see evidence? Where do you see evidence of this history informing our present? Where do you see evidence of this history informing our present? Well, here's one. And as people who are in the human services, we should be concerned about this. I'm going to give you just a little bit of this, right? And those of you who are Black and brown, you already know what this is about. A conversation with my Black son. These are parents having that famous conversation, right? Telling their story about when they had these conversations with their sons. Today, we must have these conversations with our daughters too. We must have them with our trans children and also with our children who are queer. This is May, the same week of George Floyd. I think this is a Monday. You can see that it's Wednesday reported in the Daily News, May 27th. So it happened earlier that week. And you see Floyd over here on the ground, right? And you all know this story, so I won't belabor it. I don't know if you saw this, and this is often what we hear. Why must, we're hearing a lot of this right now, especially in light of the Capitol and January 6th, where they're a lot like those BLM people, those Black Lives Matter people. And so here's this interesting young person's Trevor Noah saying, when Colin Kaepernick knelt, they said, this is not the right way to protest. When MLK marched in Selma, this is not the right way to protest. When people marched in the streets of South Africa during apartheid, this is not the right way to protest. There is no right way to protest because that's what protest is. It can't be considered right by the system that is protesting. And if you felt some kind of way watching a Target store being looted, try to imagine what it must feel like for Black Americans to watch themselves being looted every single day. Police in America are looting Black bodies. And this is where I end. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Baldwin said it this way: the past is not past. The past is in our present. And this last gift is the song Lift Every Voice and Sing. This is a recording from 1990. It was written by James Weldon Johnson. And I offer it as an example of what people who are required to fight and protest to be treated as human beings do to take care of their human spirit as we protest and fight for freedoms that are given to everyone else as a right of citizenship. I thank you for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure to present this material to you, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Tolliver, thank you so much. I've got to tell you, the chat room is afire. So why don't we just begin? What an amazing presentation.
Okay, let me just get out of this.
Okay, you ready?
Yes.
All right, so the first question is from Anthony, and he says, what's the source of resilience and determination that enables African Americans to thrive despite such great adversity and intolerance?
That's a great question.
Mhm.
And you only need to look at that young youth poet laureate who read her poem at the inauguration to answer that question. Poetry, music, dance, joy, foodways. In our communities, we have many healing spaces. Basketball courts are places where we heal. Our churches can be places where we heal. Sitting down together and having a meal is a place where we heal. I mean, one person who is a videographer said that the cultures that actually survive are the cultures where people carried the culture in their head. So you think about the Africans who were enslaved in this country, who could not read English, who were not taught to read English, who were not taught to write English, yet they learned it anyway and found a way to talk and communicate, and they carried their culture in their head. Um, One of my aunts, Anna Eliza, whose husband was lynched in the early 1900s because he killed another one of my uncles. My uncle Alfred killed my uncle Mitch. Um, these two black men who were married to two sisters. One kills the other one. And Uncle Alfred had told my other uncle, if I ever hear you call my name again, I will kill you. And you think about that. You think about the young people who get into fights because they are disrespected, who are dissed, right? And you think about where does that come from as mental health practitioners? What would have people kill each other over being disrespected? It's because this history has not treated them as human beings, right? So the resilience is in us. It is in us. We have never, ever given into this notion of us being a
Yeah, that I
slave
noticed. Yeah.
and not
You
being,
opened it without us?
we're not being liberated. You're
All
not
right.
muted. You're not
All right.
muted, Ruth. You're not muted.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Um, So we never given in to this, and we fought every step of the way. Our young people today produce music. Our people produce style. People all over the world imitate our style, our swag. We are a force to be reckoned with, right? We are. And part of this force coming into itself for me was facilitated during the Black Power movement of the night from 1960s to 1980, where we finally embraced the fact that we are Black. Because if you had told me I was Black earlier in my life in the 1950s, we would have gotten into a fight about that because we didn't want to be called Black. We wanted to be called Negroes. Today, after years of using the slogan, Black is beautiful, that's what we did to heal ourselves by calling ourselves beautiful, right? And those of us who are practitioners working with Black people need to understand that. Anyone out there?
I have a follow-up to that from Michelle, and she says that she works with adults with serious mental illness and that they're often very isolated from healing spaces in their own communities. So how can service providers work to connect them to those healing spaces you talked about?
Okay. So it just so happens, and who asked that question?
That was Michelle.
Michelle. It just so happens that Tiffany McFadden and I have had the great pleasure of doing some virtual healing circles with people in East Harlem. So one thing you can do, like, first of all, maybe you don't need to call them healing. You might just want to call them a coffee chat. You might want to call them a prayer circle. I don't know. You need to know something about the people who you are developing this for. And the language, how you language this offering needs to be consistent with the way that people talk, right? Um, So like when I was in Senegal, it might be done in a drumming circle. When I was in Dakar, young people gave me a drum and told me to go find my rhythm. I'm still looking for it, right? But there are ways to bring people together. Storytelling is healing. You understand that? I mean, I know that there are folks who work in schools who are trying to help young people learn how to read. And what they do is to get the young people to first tell their own story, write your own story, and then read your story. And now let's take that story and choreograph it and make it into a dance, right? So it actually gets into your DNA. You don't have to call it a healing circle, and you may not want to call it mental health services. You may just want to call it people talking with people.
I have a question from Anthony, and
Yes,
he says, why is it common for northbound migrants to rarely tell their children the stories of the South during the Great Migration?
that's a very great question, Anthony. My dad did not tell me my grandparents, his parents, were born slaves. My father's parents were born slaves. This past summer, I've spent and continue to work with a genealogy researcher to identify my own family members. And something I didn't tell you in that history, most of us cannot get beyond 1870 in finding our people. We were able to, because I'm descendant of African slaves on both sides of my family. My mother's, not her parents, but her grandparents were born slaves. Her parents were born free in Finchburg, Alabama. My dad's parents were born slaves in Georgia, near Valdosta, Georgia. That section of Georgia had the highest number of slaves in the state of Georgia because of cotton and the other things that they were growing there. And I don't know, my father, we didn't find any of this out until my daddy was dead. After he was dead, my Aunt Eliza, who was his elder sister, born in 1888, she didn't tell us. She didn't tell us her husband was lynched either. He wasn't lynched. He was actually executed for killing his brother-in-law. One uncle killed another uncle. They didn't tell us any of this. And so we're left only to guess why they wouldn't tell us. I suspect there was a lot of trauma, and I don't have to suspect that. I mean, if your husband killed your sister's husband, I know that that separated my Aunt Eliza from my Aunt Anna. And I know that she and Aunt Anna and Aunt Lola had probably no contact with each other because we have yet to find Aunt Anna's and Aunt Lola's descendants. My mother's father was killed by a white man who wanted to date my grandfather's oldest daughter, Aunt Leela. They didn't tell, my mother told us that story. I never met any of my grandparents, right? So my mother told us stories, but it was my father's family that we knew more about. Why don't people tell? I think it's the pain. I think it's also people, there's a sense, even in telling this history, when I go around and I do presentations about this history, often white people will say to me, but if you tell this history, it's going to make the Black people feel hopeless. That's not true. We know better. We know that this history doesn't stop us from excelling. But the truth must be reconciled with. And even if people don't tell you this history, then it's your responsibility to go and learn it. Because knowing who you are makes you grounded and strong. And nobody can then tell you who you are because I know who I am. I know my ancestors now going back to 1790. I even know the white man where my name comes from. His name was James Tolliver, but they spelled it Talifero. Taliaferro, but it's pronounced Tolliver, right?
Wow, that's fascinating. Such rich history. I've actually got a question from Harry. He asked, how important is it to teach young people that Black people's history did not start with slavery? My mother always said we hide the things we're ashamed of. Is this part of the reason?
That's an interesting question, and I don't pretend to know the answer to that one. Um, I don't. I travel to West Africa, and I quite frankly, I think, Harry, we all should go. And I don't think this is Black people's history. In fact, I've been asked to do some work here in the community where I grew up in Apalachicola, Florida. And the person who asked me is somebody who's connected with the Chamber of Commerce. And he said, would you develop an African-American history for us? And I thought about it, and I said yes, but then I thought about it and I said, no, we're not going to call it an African-American history. It is Apalachicola history. Because you see, if we segregate this history, all human history goes back to Africa. All of it, right? All of it goes back to Africa. And if we say this is separate history called African American history, then people can pick and choose. This is your history. This is America's history. And part of the reason that we have this mess going on in this country right now is because we've never reckoned with this history. So there are people who are going around saying this stuff didn't happen, just like they say that the Jewish Holocaust did not happen, right? But in Germany, imagine, and Brian Stevenson said this, and I think he's right about this. Imagine in Germany, a person running for political office saying, let's make Germany great again. But that's what we do. That's what we have in this country. Make America great again. And exclude Muslims, exclude people from a-hole countries, right? So it's history. And the reason I spent time in West Africa was because I wanted to know who I am in terms of my African history. So now I told you that with the DNA, I know that I'm 86% African. And I know 29% of that is Nigerian, 6% of that is Senegalese, and so forth and so on. But when I was in West Africa, people could look at me and tell me who my people were, right? And I have a major problem with the Ancestry.com. They have a lot of nerve to make Black people who are descendant of Africans pay them money to get a DNA. We didn't do that to ourselves. This country should pay for us to learn who we are. And that 1870 problem in the census, prior to 1870, my ancestors were not named. They were only listed as a number, right? So we had to know the plantation owner who owned them to get their names. And why were they only listed as a number? Because we were 3/5 of a person. We were not whole people. And they needed to know the number to figure out and apportion congressional members for that state.
This is powerful.
This is our history,
all
of our history. And those of you who just came over here, this is your history too, especially if you take the identity of white, because white is based on this history.
We have a follow-up question. As a result of the Civil War, white plantation owners were paid reparations for losing their slaves.
Absolutely.
How did this help the slave-driven Southern economy? And is the lack of appetite for paying reparations to African descendants of slaves another example of racially driven policies?
Absolutely, it's racially driven policy. Not only did they get reparations in terms of payment for the loss of their slaves, you're absolutely right about that. You know your history. Congratulations. Then over billions of dollars were spent through that FHA to help white people become a middle class, right? They owe us for that too, because we didn't get money for that. Now, here's another issue. In South Africa, when apartheid ended, Nelson Mandela was elected president. And I don't hold that out as the solution here. But the idea is, if the people who benefited from these policies are still in charge of determining policy, then we get exactly what we see happening right now. We have on January 6th, a riotous mob. On January 13th, an impeachment decision in Congress. And then on January 20th, we have an inauguration. And the new president stands up and says, we must have unity, right? Of course, we must have unity. But how do you have unity without justice and reckoning? You can't move away from this stuff, and we've been moving away from it for 400 years. And those of us who are in this field, now, quite frankly, this is not just a white people problem, right? Because there are far too many Black people in our field who go into communities where there are Black and brown people and give them short shrift, like knowing full well that when you're doing this child welfare investigation, people are not required to do a urine test, but we tell them they have to do one anyway. But we don't do that. And quite frankly, the people who we're investigating live across the street on 79 or live in 79th Street where there's a dormant building, we can't even get into those buildings, right? Bell Hooks said this. She said, at some point, racism no longer was useful to her analysis of what Black people do to each other. And that's important too. We must problematize that. That is a white supremacy issue, where we have learned to value whiteness over Blackness. This history taught us that.
You have so many questions coming in. We've got like a minute left, but I actually want to read one from Alan. And he says, as Black people have been invalidated by their identities, this refusal to acknowledge barriers and equity continue today. What can a white support service provider do in addressing systemic issues when working with others who've been traumatized based on their race?
Okay, so thank you for that question. So here's what, I can't remember the author, but this is what he says about white people. And I think it's instructive. Malcolm says something too, like when people ask Malcolm, what can you do? What can we do to support this effort, bringing liberation for all people? So what I've learned in the past 3 or 4 years is from reading people in South America, scholars in South America who are writing about the need to identify and disrupt ideologies of domination. Colonialism created multiple binaries, Black, white, male, female, gay, straight, rich, poor, right? And those identities balkanize us. They keep us separated and apart. So go back to in the slide presentation, you look at Bacon's Rebellion and how the ruling elites use that to create a separation from people. In order for us to understand each other, we need to be in relationship with each other and have long conversations such that I will learn how colonialism has hurt you and you will learn how it has hurt me. You cannot come episodically into these struggles. Vincent Harding, a historian, says that for Black Americans, there has been a river of struggle for the entire time that we have been here. But here's the deal. What we struggle for benefits us all. We're struggling for our humanity. And Black women in the Kambachi a group said, when Black women are free, all people who are being oppressed would have to be free because Black women are at the bottom. Right? So we have work to do, and that work is to be in relationship. Those healing circles must be multi-racial. They have to be queer. They can't be just straight. They have to include people who are living with disabilities, because quite frankly, COVID is impacting people of color with disabilities far greater than is impacting other people of color. Right? So we must get out of our boxes and our own spaces of oppression and embrace relationships with people so that we understand all oppressions and how they work together to maintain the status quo.
Dr. Tolliver, this was amazing and a powerful education, and you've made us all stronger and armed us with the information to be part of that healing you talked about today.
Awesome. And the other thing too, those of us who are doing this work, bring people together in groups, even in your work. Stop doing all this individual work. These are not individual problems. These are collective problems. Bring people together in groups. Let them work and learn from each other.
NIAPers thanks you. And
Thank
thank you
you.
all so much for joining us. I will share the chat box with you, Dr. Tolliver, because there are many questions there, but also many accolades that you definitely earned.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.